I want to invite my next panel up, and I'm really enthused about this panel. When Michelle started talking today, she had everyone show their hands, how many people are here from former DEP employees. What Michelle did not say is that some of the brightest minds in environmental policy have worked at DEP, and I've invited, I think some of the best of those minds up here today to talk about how do we get DEP to function better. So looking forward, I'm going to invite our moderator, former DEP commissioner, former EPA Region 2 administrator, Chris Daggett. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and good afternoon. I recognize we are between you and lunch and leaving, so we will try to make this as entertaining as possible. I'm not going to go through formal introductions because you have a QR code that talks about everybody here on the panel. I've kidded them saying it's a little bit of the used to be's and has-beens, trying to tell you a little bit about what our thoughts are. And the scary part is, as I look around the room, I see some people that weren't born when I was the DEP commissioner, so it's a little bit difficult. But in any event, what we really want to do is focus on ways to improve the DEP. And we're going to do this with each of the panelists speaking for maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll make a proposal toward the end and then open it up for questions and answers from all of you. We're going to start with Gary Sondermeyer doing an overview of the issues as we see them facing the DEP. The second is, Dennis Hart is going to do the issues overview. Gary Sondermeyer is going to talk about key DEP responsibilities. We're going to have Irene and Ray talk about the organizational process and some issues associated with that. And then Dan will wrap it up with interagency communications coordination. So hopefully at the end you'll have an overview from us, because collectively I think we probably have at least 100 years of experience at the DEP, which also is a little bit scary, but we've been around this game a long, long time. And so with that, Dennis, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Commissioner. It's a pleasure to be here with such a fine group of people. I've been tasked to talk a little bit about the history of DEP and how we got to where we are. I had a conversation once with former Congressman Bob Rowe, who probably had more to do with the environmental improvements in New Jersey than probably any person. And he was commissioner of the Department of Commerce and Department of Conservation and Economic Development, which was the predecessor to DEP. He was commissioner from 63 to 69. And he asked Governor Hughes, why do I have both conservation and economic development reporting to me? And he said, because I don't want two people arguing in front of me, so you get to make all those decisions. And I'm going to refer back later to that decision, because there's a point in that story, other than just me rambling. But the department was created in 1970 on Earth Day, and we have the Department of Environmental Protection. We no longer have a Department of Commerce, which is one of our pet peeves in New Jersey. But the department had a mission at that time, and the mission of the department at that time was, I'm going to call it just emergency situations in every venue. Like, I do a lot of talks, particularly environmental groups, and I ask them, how many people have ever heard of chemical control? Anybody in here, raise your hand if you heard of chemical control. Probably the biggest environmental disaster in the history of the state in the late 1970s, where a organized crime sort of based organization, where drums ended up all over Elizabeth on the streets, and one night it blew up. And in Staten Island, I think there were 3 or 4 nights where you couldn't open your windows. But people forget where we were in New Jersey. Since I'm old, it started with DEP in 1981 and Water Resource Enforcement. It was a common occurrence for people to step on a hypodermic needle at the shore. We were ocean dumping sewage sludge. Hopefully the barges made it to 106 miles from 11 New Jersey sewage treatment plants plus New York City. And the state was a mess environmentally. You know, the shad run up the Delaware River, where I grew up swimming in the summertime, there was 0 shad because of the oxygen block in Philadelphia. And now we have a phenomenal environment in New Jersey. If you think about where we are now today, we've dealt with the emergency things. July 1, 1988 was the secondary treatment deadline for New Jersey. We had, when I started as a sewer inspector, there were literally hundreds, if not 1,000 sewer plants in this state, all these tiny little things polluting every little stream. Federal money, the federal SRF to state money, consolidated regional plants. I would argue the single biggest water quality improvement in the state was that deadline of July 1, where DEP, I think, signed nearly 200 administrative consent orders to get municipalities to comply with that deadline at that point. Then we have the Clean Water Enforcement Act. Mandatory penalties with no discretion New Jersey has for any water resources discharges in this state. You never even hear about the Clean Water Enforcement Act any longer. It was a disaster when it went into effect because everyone's complying. When was the last time you saw an article about somebody violating a permit with a discharge to a surface water body? Right? We're meeting our air quality attainment goals in New Jersey. Right? That's a big deal. Superfund. One of my pet peeves is the thing that New Jersey has more Superfund sites than any other state. That's absolutely wrong. We, during the Kane administration, were directed to list every single site we could think of from site remediation issues to EPA because we would gather the most money from EPA. So what did that give us? It gave us the worst PR nightmare in history. To where we have sites like a little dry cleaner, a little helicopter repair shop at a Monmouth airport, are Superfund sites. They're not the American Cyanamid or the Civic or these suits. These are the normal, run-of-the-mill site remediation projects that we deal with. But now we've been stuck for 40 years with that hanging over our head that we have the most Superfund sites. We have drinking water quality. I would argue our drinking water quality is the envy of the country, if not the envy of the world. Most of the world would kill to have the drinking water quality we have. Yet if you read the news, you think that we have the worst drinking water quality. We have bad infrastructure. You all know we still have water pipes made out of wood in Jersey City and Hoboken. And I would argue that we should be spending more money fixing that so that we're not losing 40% of the water that we're treating to 4 parts per trillion of PFAS. Let's stake it at 15 parts per trillion of PFAS and use that differential money to fix our infrastructure. I think we're at a different point now in environmental protection in New Jersey. Unfortunately, the department hasn't kept up, and I think the rest of the panel is going to talk about what's the real mission of the department nowadays. Over the years, the legislature and administration has added more programs, and we were all charged when we were there with adding more programs. Unfortunately, all those programs were added on as add-ons and not incorporated. So I've been fixated lately at looking at the DEP organization chart. It lists all the senior managers at DEP. There are 63 boxes on the DEP organization chart. Division directors and above, plus offices reporting directly to the commissioner's office. 63. At a time period where I think we said there's about 3,000 employees. At one point, the department had 4,000 employees and 5 assistant commissioners, maybe 4. Now we have 8 assistant commissioners. 63 boxes. 15 of those boxes report directly to Commissioner Latourette. 15 people are his direct reports as commissioner. And so with all of these different division directors, all of these different programs, there is no overall theme of what are we trying to accomplish with the department. Everything ends up at the commissioner, and there's not a single person alive that can handle having 12 senior managers report to him to argue over or to plan or to direct the department. So I really think, the rest of the group is going to look at, what's the department's mission now? How best to accomplishment? Are the things that we've been doing for 40 years that are successful that we don't need to do anymore, similar to the site remediation model? And can those people doing that address environmental justice, address recycled content, address all of the new things that the department really doesn't have a history of dealing with?
Great. Thank you, Dennis. Gary?
Sure. I like podiums. So thank you, Chris. And what I volunteered to speak about today is sort of the fun subject of typing into Google the very simple question, what does the NJDEP do? And Michelle really started the program off absolutely spot on today by saying it's such a complex agency, literally a dizzying scope of responsibility and span of control. So I'm going to date myself. and try to do like a David Letterman top 10 of what the department's responsibilities are in categorical kind of fashion and without priority, because every one of these things is extremely important. But number one, permitting. Of course, everyone thinks of DEP as a regulatory agency and all the media permits, air, water, waste, land use. And there are some that think that every form of human activity is regulated by DEP. Now, that is not true. That is a bit of an exaggeration. Number two, goes in hand with permitting, is enforcement. Of course, and enforcement ties directly to the permitting, so all the media enforcement activities, air, water, waste, land use. Then beyond that, coordination with all the County Environmental Health Act agencies that they delegate authority to under an annual work plan. Things that aren't necessarily organizationally with enforcement, but coastal beach monitoring. The helicopter going up and down every day on the Jersey Shore to make sure that we don't have solids and floatables. Testing to make sure that we don't have fecal coliform bacteria levels that prevent beach use and access, which is enormously important to New Jersey's economy and tourism. Things like shellfish bed monitoring in cooperation with our Department of Health. DEP is the one that issues the fish advisories when the fish are too contaminated for folks to fish and eat. All DEP. Number three, planning. Enormous scope of planning responsibilities. The holy grail in the future of air pollution control is a state implementation plan. Most people don't even know that thing exists. Enormously important plan. In the climate world, the Global Warming Response Act 80/50 report and the resilience plan. Very important to implement the governor's public policy agenda. The state solid waste management plan that all 21 county recycling and solid waste recycling plants have to line up to, drives all the behavior throughout the state. The water quality management plans, the water supply master plan, goes on and on. These are just examples and snippets of the planning category. Number four, funding, enormous funding organization. $9 billion has been given out in terms of loans and short-term construction grants to the Environmental Infrastructure Trust or the Water Bank or the Infrastructure Bank. Thank you to Dennis Hart for his leadership in many years with the EIT. And the EIT is an in but not of, but the department has enormous responsibilities in managing that program. Green Acres started in 1961, $3.3 billion in referendum funding that was approved by the citizens of the state for open space preservation. And at this point, we're up to 1.6 million acres of preserved land in the state of New Jersey. That's phenomenal. And beyond these two examples, others like the Spill Act assistance, the Recycling Enhancement Act funding, many, many more. Fifth category, stewardship. DEP is responsible for managing 51 parks and forests, 122 wildlife management areas, 48 historic sites, 19 campgrounds, and 6 marinas. Collectively, that represents 452,000 acres of land management that the department is responsible for. Daunting. Then beyond that, the whole fish and wildlife program. You mentioned those magic T&E, the threatened endangered species monitoring, work of the Natural Lands Management Program, the Trails program that the department has, issuing hunting and fishing licenses. Amazing. DEP. Site cleanup, sixth category. Dennis alluded to the Superfund list, 115 MPL sites, highest number in the country. 20,000 contaminated sites, which were identified in 2009 when the Site Remediation Reform Act was passed. And thank you to Irene Kropp for her incredible leadership and leading to the LSRP program over time. And at least a current metric, I don't know what today's Dave might be able to tell us the current number, about 13,000 contaminated sites remaining that I saw as of 2022. I don't know if that's perfectly accurate or not. Seventh category, emergency response. Michelle mentioned emergency response as well. Warn DEP. What is the department responsible for? chemical releases, environmental emergencies, wildlife issues, forest fires, industrial accidents, illegal hunting and fishing, and homeland security, terrorist threats. DEP has been responsible for homeland security planning for the chemical, petroleum, water, wastewater, nuclear, pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and dam safety sectors for the past 25 years. Probably didn't even know that, but DEP has designated all the critical infrastructure sites and put best management practices in place across the entire state. And a final shout out in the emergency response category to the Forest Fire Service. These people are amazing. Under mutual aid, they travel around the entire country helping to put out the worst forest fires that we have each year. Amazing, part of DEP. Eighth category, somewhat one that we don't think about, sorry.
In back to emergency response, you left out responding to pig farms and chicken farms.
Sure. To Irene's point, Deptford, New Jersey, and Secaucus were the pig capitals of New Jersey. And in Deptford Township, the pig farms literally became cleanup sites as landfills because pigs, unbeknownst to most folks, I went to Cook College, so I know this, they're very discriminating. When you dump the slop on the pad, they like pick through and they leave all the garbage. And that goes in the back 40 on the farm. So how many farms did we have to remediate? Thank you, Irene, you're absolutely right. Eighth category, enormously important, information management. I think one of the top 5 most important things DEP ever did is the New Jersey Environmental Management System, or NGEMS, which was also led by Irene Kropp. Thank you, Irene. Enormously important to break down the silos. So all the different divisions of the department and the information, the permits that they link are all combined together so you can see and break out of the silo because air affects water, affects land. GIS mapping program. I remember at Cook College with Marty McHugh and Kerry Kirk-Flew over here that we used to do natural resource inventories with acetate sheets and colored magic markers to try to identify sensitive environmental receptors that are out there. Today, look at the GIS capability that comes from the department. It helps inform every land use decision from every local zoning and planning board across the state. Incredible amount of information. Data miner, New Jersey Geologic Survey, information that's out there. Science and research. I mean, it's not maybe considered information management per se, but the department did a reform. Gosh, how many years ago? 20 years ago? To shrink the Division of Science and Research and use an external science advisory board, which analyzes these extraordinarily complex technical issues and comes back with information to help guide, hopefully, logical decision-making by the department. And finally, we just had a session on EJ. The EJ Burden Communities and Cumulative Impact Database is incredible. I was there when that started. It started 25 years ago to assemble that database that allowed the state to implement the EJ law. We're getting there. Number 9, can't not mention standard setting. The department issues standards, incredibly important, drive all kinds of behavior, groundwater standards, surface water standards, drinking water standards, soil remediation standards. I would even argue what Ray said earlier with his big stack, that 5-foot sea level rise becomes a de facto standard because it affects all the planning and eventually the regulatory decision-making that comes from that. So a hugely important area. And finally, I know it's getting tiresome, public policy, number 10. And public policy, and this has to be realized in appreciating how difficult the task is for the agency. Every 4 or 8 years, we have something called an election. And every governor that comes in, I worked under 11 New Jersey governors, every single one of them, even the short-term governors, Senate President Don DeFrancesco and Dick Cody, had their own separate agendas. And that directly impacts the public policy driving force down within the agency on what is the focus areas. And the current administration, just to list a few, obviously climate, mitigation and adaptation, environmental justice, plastics, mitigation, offshore wind, other renewable energy forms, shore protection, electrification, enhanced stormwater management, and an ongoing focus on brownfield redevelopment. Whew. And the final thing that I want to mention, that I would often talk to my DEP colleagues, because it was always, the idea that we don't have enough resources was there every day of my 30 years I was there. Everybody felt that way. They still feel that way. And, I would ask a question for perspective. Have you ever seen a law repealed? Really, anybody? Have you ever seen a law repealed? So it's 100% additive. Every one of those new administrations dealing with the legislature want to have new programs. So it just piles. Ray, that was great, your visual of the land use, right? Well, think about all the laws that have been passed and the department's responsible for. So I just wanted to frame how dizzying the responsibilities are, and I'm sure that landed. Thank you.
It is pretty daunting. Okay, so Irene and Ray on the organizational processes.
So Gary made us all look at all the great things about the DEP and all the wonderful things it does, and Ray and I are going to tear it down a little bit. So maybe this will be interesting. So in all the years that we've worked with, and I'll touch on some of these things, we've done a lot of things with transition, all different internal reviews, NGEMs, and site remediation program. But the thing that always eats at me was there was never a sense of urgency within the department and within the staff to really get approvals out the door, whether they were negative or positive, a permit or enforcement action. It was just drag on, drag on, drag on. And so to instill that sense of urgency within the staff, that has got to be driven by management, and it has to be driven by a really close management team that works together across programs and within programs, and Ray's going to touch a little bit more on that, but let me just give a couple of real quick examples. Well, I'll give you one quick example. When I was putting together the NGEMS database, and it was a long, long process, one of the things I had to do was get air major permitting, air minor permitting, and air emissions and air enforcement to all agree that this stack was going to be called Stack A. They were never doing that. Everybody had their own name for an area or a stack or a burner unit or whatever. And for every single Wednesday morning for about a year straight, with Entenmann's pastries by their side, I sat there and tried to get these people to agree. And I had the managers, and I had some of the key people, and I had the IT people. But it took that long within the AIR program to get that inter-program cooperation and coordination, which is pretty darn scary. And I'm going to harken back to many, many, many moons ago. There was a huge chemical company that had a lagoon that site remediation and hazardous waste was saying, you have to close that lagoon because it's hazardous waste lagoon and it needs to be closed. And the land use folks and the fish and wildlife folks said, you can't close that lagoon. It's got phragmites, And we actually had Deputy Commissioner at the time, Mike Catania, get us all in the room and really yell at us, everybody, to make sure that the programs were working together. So that plus my experience with site remediation program is very, very interesting because with regards to the sense of urgency, I got that myself from a bunch of different things that happened at the same time, from Kitty College, for those of you who know it, that created the daycare scare, to a couple of other major sites that were happening at the time, to Kropp and Hudson County. There was all of a sudden this morning when I woke up and I'm like, we can't do this. We have 20,000 sites. I can't sleep at night. How can we let the people of New Jersey be exposed to this? We have to come up with something new. So the sense of urgency there led to another interagency discussion, cooperation with the outside folks through a stakeholder group, and then Bob Smith rallying the cause for us to get the entire site remediation program and the folks on the outside agreeing to what we were told would never happen, which is the development of the LSRP program. So one of the things we also want to talk about is using technology in the future and cooperation with the other folks in the future to make these groups coordinate and talk together. So I'm going to leave some of the program coordination stuff to Ray, and we'll bounce back to another couple of things.
So I can't believe I'm going to say this, but Gary, you missed two. And I was like counting out and going, man, I got to find one or two to mention. Education. There's an education program, Kerry, there for a very long time. And on top of that, you have everybody in Natural and Historic Resources teaching kids interpretive, skills about science and history every single day in dozens and dozens of people. Which also leads me to one other that I'm sure everybody in this room has touched at one point or another, historic preservation. And you think about that, we're really looking at a department that is EPA, the Department of Interior, National Parks, all rolled into one. So the complexity is unbelievable. And for those of you who don't know me, I actually started in the air program. First time I really got to work with Irene was over Entenmann's. Before NGEMS, it was actually called AIRS. That's where it started. And I was sat as part of those teams with Wolf's team from the enforcement perspective and trying to balance those things out. But I bounced all over the department, and I think one of the things that that stands out to me all the time is that we've been and I say we because I think half the room worked at the DEP. We're all still there in our heart. We've done incredible things. Gary listed them out. Tackling discharge issues. Air quality is so much improved. I was actually hired as a result of the Clean Air Act, so thank God for that, because that was the only place that was hiring in the early 90s. We've done a really good job, but to everyone else's point, we've never taken anything off the plate. And not only rules not being repealed, but we don't even peel back process, because we get really entrenched in doing what we do and not letting go. And I think Ray and Michelle touched on it a lot this morning with land use rules. When I worked for Irene in part of the transformation processes that a lot of you probably remember at the start of the Christie administration, we talked about trying to streamline processes, and there was a lot of emphasis being put on permits by rule and general permits, which became permits by certification. And I've had many debates with my land use colleagues, which I did spend a long time in the land use program, so I worked with them really closely on why we did not need to review these things, because they were the low-hanging fruit, the catchphrases that everybody uses. We didn't need to see these. We need to apply our focus somewhere else. We needed to be more holistic and look at cross-programmatic issues and solve bigger problems so that we can evolve. As the problems became new, we needed to be able to adapt and go into those problems. And I think if we look around today, whether we're talking about an overburdened community or environmental restorations, you have to look at nets, and we have to be able to look across media lines. And there's always been pockets and opportunities, efforts, and so I'm not saying that I was successful or any of us. We've seen permit coordination, we've seen alternative dispute resolution, we've had great opportunities. Bill Lindner is here today. He ran the Community Collaborative Initiative, where we really tried to get people from the grassroots perspective and understanding what communities wanted, and then try to pull the media together to make net gains. But it's not DEP staff, it's not DEP management, it's the entire system's responsibility, in my opinion, because we look at it from a legislative perspective down, that there's a new standard put on, but there's not that flexibility to think about the net impacts. Ray touched on some of them this morning. If we're talking about land use, and now we're going to have stormwater impacts, and is that going to prevent us from doing a brownfield redevelopment that really could improve a community? And the answer is yes, it's gonna. And we've had so many of those issues. Irene talked a lot about, or touched on, site remediation, but I had a few issues myself, actually, when I transitioned from enforcement to NHR. I brought along with me a couple of really significant water issues. And the fly in the ointment there was we had a historic preservation issue. So when I was in enforcement, I found myself kind of arguing with Rich Bornasian and some of the other people at Chippo. And then when I moved over to that side, I got to understand it. And I think that we need to get to the point where we empower staff, have them think more holistically. We do want programmatic experts. People need to be like the experts in their field if they're an air person or a water person or a remediation person. But we need to have a greater understanding of the holistic nature of what we do to find those net gains. There's cause and effect to everything. Nothing is perfect. And I think that we need to try to instill that as we go forward. I think I'm going to stop there.
But following up on your point, it's really important for us in the, let's say, DEP management to use the resources of the staff and encourage the staff to participate and come up with the new ideas. What we do with site remediation is I held staff meeting after staff meeting after staff meeting of the entire SRP organization to get individual people's comments and individual people heard. I sat down with all my managers to find out what they wanted so that they could be heard. But I was listening and I was coordinating with the other managers within the department. If you empower the staff and allow the staff to do a great job and encourage them, that's fine. But you don't want to lose that managerial, overarching push for inter-program coordination, which is so key. Everything can't funnel up to the commissioner. Everything can't be made decisions by staff, because that's that sense of urgency thing. They have their programs. They know what they do. They don't really care when they get that permit out for you in particular, or if your site is developed timely enough, or the approval for that permit is conditioned on something, that is a part of it. So what are they doing? They need the sense of urgency that only comes from management, and management working as a team and working as a team together.
I agree with that. And there are a couple of easy examples I could throw out there, but they're complex. They sound simple, but Gary touched on Green Acres. If we didn't have a state land acquisition program, boy, we'd be looking at complete and total build out. So huge success. But the stewardship of those lands, which Gary also touched on, and Sean was there with me many times when we talked about acquiring a property, and the fight would, this is within my own world. When I was in NHR, I'd have the Division of Parks and Forestry and the Division of Fish and Wildlife fighting over pushing that piece of property away because neither wanted it in their purview because there were no operational dollars and no ability to manage that piece of land. So we tried to turn that around to say, let's try to provide an incentive for everybody and have a jump ball. You should want this ball, not get the ball. So, we worked with the legislature and tried to talk about CBT and other things to resolve those issues. But my point is that Irene is right. At some point, we need to understand what the greater good is, and management needs to say it will get resolved. And you need to find the medium and the middle ground on this. And one of the best things that I give credit, I think Wolf had a lot to do with this. I know Irene did, but prior to me even working in ADR for a while, way back in my early enforcement days, we did interest-based negotiation training for all the inspectors in enforcement. Best training I've ever had in my life. And trying to get to that mediation of an issue, because we talked about this in the hallway, even permit coordination. Every permit coordination meeting I ever sat in, didn't matter if I was sitting there as the regulator, the enforcement person, or the manager, there was really never a lot of contention with the applicant. It was always between the programs. And understandably, like everybody has a standard that they need to meet within their program, but it takes that management will and that management leadership to instill, you're going to come to a resolution and achieve a net gain.
All good points, thanks. You want to say one more thing, Irene?
Yeah, I wanted to say one more thing because we talk about all the different programs that haven't been taken off the plate. We talk about institutional memory and institutional memory leaving the department. What we really need to focus on is new staff, next generation staff, next generation ideas, and more importantly, next generation IT. There is so much that could be done by the push of a button that does not need 25 eyes on them, 25 sets of eyes on them. We have to make sure that it's required. We did it in, I think we did it in OPA, but we definitely did it in Site Remediation Act. Electronic. That's outdated. You know, we need to look at AI. We need to look at some way of taking things off the plate and saying, this is going to go that way, and technology and new growth and new environmental issues have to be handled a completely different way.
Great. Dan?
All right.
Interagencies.
Okay. So my name is Dan Kennedy. I'm currently the CEO of the NAIOP New Jersey chapter, which is New Jersey's Commercial Real Estate Development Association. Challenged myself to add to Gary's list, and I would say disaster recovery would be an additional role and responsibilities, and that's kind of the tide that brought me into the DEP post-Sandy. My background is more planning. I worked with, I think, four different state departments. Department of Agriculture, Department of State, DEP, and then Bob Martin liked to throw me in all the little committees and commissions all throughout the state. So I sat as ex officio at places like the EDA board, the DVRPC, groups like that. That gave me a really kind of catbird seat. I'm a classically trained planner, so don't hold that against me. I have been trained to see the world through multiple lenses, not just the departments. Environmental protection touches obviously on all the three stools of sustainability, three legs of the stool of sustainability. I'm going to make things even harder because all we're doing so far in the last 45 minutes is talk about the DEP. One of the things that I'd like to just raise the fact that the DEP at times doesn't participate well with others. So you've got the DOT, you've got the EDA, you've got the DCA, you've got all those critical functions, and not only do the new folks we have to bring in the DEP to train folks up need to work well with the other divisions within DEP, well, at times they need to know how to work with the DOT. They need to deal with affordable housing issues and balance these priorities of public policy. At times, I think working in DEP, you feel like you're, kind of at a really complicated Thanksgiving dinner with family, where, most of the year we don't get along, but there's times you kind of come to the table and you get along. I had a consigliere that worked for me essentially when I came into the department as a fresh person, a fresh set of eyes in the water program. And he kind of gave me the key code of who used to be married and who's married now. And that's not really it's a weird environment at times, honestly, to operate within. You really need to kind of have the key code to relationships. But it gets even harder when you're talking about how does DOT get along with DEP? My last job was working for an organization that focused on transportation and infrastructure, water infrastructure contracts. And there's times I had to introduce senior leaders of DEP to senior leaders of the DOT and facilitate conversations between them because the leads of the organizations at times don't get along very well, and they're kind of working at cross purposes at the time. So I think we also have to build a culture at DEP of being open to the idea that the environment is not the only priority. We have to have the economic development priorities met and the community priorities met. And sometimes that means, gritting and bearing it and moving forward. So the state is going to be releasing a state plan. The DEP is one of many members of the State Planning Commission. One of the things I did before I worked for state government, I worked for county government and local government, and I chaired my planning board for too many years. So I think so. You have the silo, the vertical silo of the DEP. You got the horizontal relationships between the departments, but you also have that layer of how does the state policy interact with local government policy, and that town's plan and zone for whether it's industrial land or commercial or residential or other park uses. Think about how hard that is to them when the DEP is not coordinated, the agencies aren't coordinated, and then you've got pressure on a mayor, and that's, I think, some of the heart of some of the big giant NIMBY issues we have in the state, is that kind of really confusing and lack of state policy planning tool, like a state plan, to say, all right, well, this is an area where our priority is to grow, and we're gonna grit and bear it, and we're gonna let that growth happen and do it in a really well-designed way. So I think some of these failures are not just failures of DEP, but the failures of state government since the 70s and 80s to balance priorities like growth and housing and transportation and infrastructure, because no one's done it well. This is not this administration or the last administration or the one that'll come next. I don't think any administration, they've taken like the real planning tools from the 80s of the State Planning Act, the Fair Housing Act, and some of the infrastructure planning tools we've had, and really melded them together and worked with local government effectively to really see a real good future. So I think that's one of the things. One of the positives, I think, is work that we're doing now with the DCA related to third-party certifications for inspections of local government. We're working on like basically augmenting local government's approval. It's the same thing. Local governments and DEP are not letting go kind of just the same. So if DCA can be open in the legislature, Assemblyman Karabinchak has been sponsoring some really smart legislation to allow for commercial development and residential development to move forward without having every stamp of every local government official along the way, and facilitating that to repurpose these land, to get vacancies down. So the DEP needs to start following that lead. The DOT has augmented their design staff very effectively to start to take the transportation funding that's available from the federal government to move those designs forward. And you're starting to see some real progress in the delivery of transportation projects in the state. So it's not just targeted. I think it's a state agency-wide issue. We're not going to have 40-year employees. The pension and benefits aren't as good as they used to be. I think we have to really find ways to make these agencies work individually and together better. And it's going to, I think, require self-certification, third-party involvement with engineers, and some levels of augmentation of the existing bread and butter staff to move this state forward.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I've heard, I'm sure I've heard a lot more, but 7 things that I wanted to highlight from what everybody just said. First, you got to have the long view here. Some of us have been around when chemical control exploded, and when the early days of Superfund, when Dennis is right, we were aggressively going after Superfund sites in the early days of the Kane administration so that we could get the money at the national level. So ocean dumping, unbelievable. Air quality, all kinds of issues. Water quality, sewage treatment plants at the primary level, not even secondary. Particularly in the back bays in the shore areas that then wash around to the Jersey Shore and dump waste onto the Jersey Shore. The list went on and on and on and on. We have made enormous progress, particularly in New Jersey. We are, in many ways, way ahead of the rest of the country in terms of the aggressiveness of our environmental protection and the results that we've gotten from that aggressiveness. And now the trick is to hold that in place and then deal with all the new things of global warming and some of the other issues that are now coming before us that we have to do. Sea level rise. How do we respond to these issues? But when you have the long view, you can see we've made incredible progress. No more ocean dumping, air quality, as Dennis said, and others have pointed out. These are issues that have made this state a lot better. Second is legislation versus regulation. I used to talk about the fact that regulators were always blamed. We always got blamed for everything going wrong. But the fact of the matter is the legislature and the governor together pass laws that often work at total conflict with laws already on the books. And when they can't make that make sense, toss it to the regulators and say, you figure it out. And they're no better than anybody else. They're human beings trying to look at it and say, wow, this makes no sense whatsoever. And yet, you got a deadline to get that reg out, and then you got to enforce the regulation or carry it out. So we've got to figure out that intersection, or that nexus, if you will, between legislation and regulation. Third is the need for process streamlining. It's just unconscionable that some of the permitting takes not just 6 months or 9 months, but 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and longer to get a decision out of the department because there's so much on their plates. And because of all the other things that were talked about here that conflict with one another. Fourth area, should we prioritize the responsibilities of the department that Gary laid out? Should there be a prioritization process? Problem is, every one of those things at some point is the highest priority. You can't avoid that. That's the way the world works. One day it's asleep, and the next day it's on fire. And so you got to figure out, what does that mean to prioritize responsibilities? The fifth area, taking a holistic view of things, working across departments, working across bureaus within the department, and having somebody that can look at all this and say, wait a minute, we got to figure this out, and we got to do it within a time with some sense of urgency, as Irene talked about. Urgency is needed within the department. Sixth area that we didn't talk a lot about with respect to IT and artificial intelligence, the issue is procurement. We were trying to upgrade computers in the DEP. Well, by the time you get the procurement approvals, the technology that you said you're going to put in place is long outdated, and it's even going at a greater and greater speed now, every day, every week, every month, every year. So we've got to figure out how to deal with procurement in government that doesn't take this interminable amount of time to make a decision that will screw up the whole system. And seventh is Dan's point about interagency collaboration. We've got to figure out how to work better within agencies. So as we looked at all this as a group, what we wanted to propose is that there be basically a task force created that would take a year in the making. It's going to take at least a year to do it right. And it's not a task force created by the legislature, nor a task force created by the department. It's got to be all the people that are impacted, and I mean all the people. You got to get all the stakeholders in the tent. You don't want somebody on the outside throwing bricks to the inside. Hard as it is, and I've given a number of speeches talking about the hardest part about collaboration is collaborating, because it's hard. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes energy, and yet we need to do that where we take a good year. I don't know whether it's the group like the NJBIA, Michelle, and working with people like Tom Bracken at the Chamber and Tom Harmon at the African American Chamber and the various environmental groups and the various agents or groups like professional organizations of one kind or another, but we need everybody in there, and we need it led by someone who is highly respected, that's nonpartisan, and that is willing to put the commitment to it to make this happen. And if we can do that and have something ready for the next governor, male or female, white or black, Republican or Democrat or independent, don't forget that. But seriously, we would be able to present to the next governor as that person comes into office a report that's reflective of a lot of people and a lot of input that we can go forward with. So that's our hope that would come out of this kind of work, is to do that. And with that, what I'd like to do is open it up to questions. And since we're the last panel, and I'm going to impose on my fellow panelists here, if it does drift over past our time deadline, we're happy, I think, to stay for at least a few minutes longer, depending on whether you have questions that want to keep us here. But are there any questions that any of you have to any of the panelists on any of the topics that were discussed?
Wolf?
Great.
Right behind you.
One additional point on your procurement comment, hiring. You cannot wait 2 years to fill a vacancy. In some
Good point.
cases, you waited years and years before you finally filled a vacancy. That has to be added to that process to somehow streamline it. If somebody's getting ready to leave, you know there's going to be a vacancy. Start the hiring process, get somebody in there.
Good point. Dennis, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I don't have an answer to that, but I wanted to talk about something I think would interest this group. We could all talk about a million different things, and then we end up talking about nothing. But Chris, you talk about collaboration. I think one of the bigger issues we have as the department is working with the department on emerging issues, the new technologies. You know, at the Chemistry Council, between our core member companies, the chemical pharmaceutical companies, all you associate members, the engineering firms, we have some of the top experts in the country that we have offered to come in to talk to the department about what's the latest in PFAS treatment, what is the latest in plastics manufacturing, what are the issues, why this can't work, and we're continually rebuffed on things like that. I don't know if it's suspicion from regulators, but we're looking to collaborate with the department, and in two ways. One is technology. Like, let's bring in the experts that can say, here's what's going on around the country right now. Here's what Maine is doing. Here's what these people are doing. Secondly is, working with the Department on Regulations is a complete disaster. The department will set up a work group. There'll be a meeting. Then we won't hear anything. And a draft rule proposal comes in the register, and the department says, we can't talk to you because now the rule proposal's out there, and the clock is on, and the rule gets adopted. And we all say that's not what the conversation was during that process. Like, you completely misunderstood it. We go to the administrative law courts, and they look at, no matter if we say, look, this is a mistake, that's wrong, they say, well, it's a DEP. They're supposed to know what they're doing, so we give them deference, and we never win ever going in the administrative process. So what we really need is to get back to the days when there were pre-proposals. If the department wants to do a new regulation on whatever the topic is, you have a work group. The department says, here's what we heard, here's what we're thinking of a rule. You sit down and go through it. Then they can go through the formal rule proposal process. At least we have that extra step in there on the collaboration process. I think that's one of the keys. I'll give you two examples.
So maybe it's some sort of amendment to the Administrative Procedures Act that has created this process where you can't do those sorts of things.
That would be a great idea, and I know a lot of states do that, and a lot of agencies do it, so that would be a great idea. And so it plays out in things like this. You know, you all are involved in the new groundwater quality standards. There was a work group meeting in 2019. Then on the day after New Year's, January 2nd of 2024, the new regulations come out, and you get 60 days to comment, and have to beg the commissioner for an extension. And he was gracious enough, after a few phone calls, to grant a 30-day extension so we could hire Integral. We did phenomenal comments on these groundwater standards. I guarantee the response is going to be, thank you very much, and the standards are going to be adopted as they were proposed. Then we're going to go to court, and the judges will say, it's DEP, they know what they're doing. But there's problems. You know, back in, when Catherine McCabe was commissioner, and the department proposed vapor intrusion standards, we brought in some of the top experts in the country saying, look, if you have this standard for benzene on vapor intrusion, the ambient air quality in Trenton is going to violate your indoor air standards. We got a stone face, no response. So those are the kind of things where I think the collaboration, we're not going in there trying to make better for our member companies. It might appear that way, but I think that's where a lot has to happen with the department, is to really sit down on issues and say, what are we trying to accomplish? How can industry and academics come together to help to advance that?
So the baseline issue there is trust. And that's what happened with the development of the site remediation program, when people didn't trust the consultants because they just want to make money. And people didn't trust the consultants because they were going to want to get away with something. People don't trust you because you're regulated, not the regulator. And that is probably the foundation that needs to be broken. Mm-hmm. And the question is how, and unless you have really strong upper management that's willing to do it, it's not going to happen.
And I think we work together to build that trust. At the end of the day, the department has the authority to do whatever they want to do. But I think if you start that small and start working together, you'll have a better outcome that we don't have to fight about all the time.
Yep. Other questions at all? All in the back.
Hi there, Zachary Klein, Cullen and Dykeman, great panel. The question I had in terms of potential changes to the administrative procedure situation, potential legislative changes to the Administrative Procedures Act, is what are your thoughts on potential changes to the OAL? I know once upon a time it was envisioned to be something a little different, that maybe those decisions weren't going to end up having to get cleared through the DEP commissioner, which speaks to your point about how everything's starting to bottleneck. So might be more relevant to the lawyers and some of the other folks in the room, but I was curious if you had any thoughts on what the future of that relationship might look like.
Anybody?
When it comes to OAL, I really don't know. I know there's been some discussion about taking the commissioner's oversight authority to override the OAL away, but I can't foresee that ever happening. But you know, I think right now, just on the front end, is probably the most we'll have an opportunity for, right?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that. That I think, you know, on the front end, you're talking about sweeping change there, but I think that there have been a lot of efforts over the last, decade or so. And I think it goes back to resolving issues and finding middle ground. Like, we made a concerted effort in C&E to resolve cases and try to get away from just piling paper down or issuing that big fine to open their eyes, which I've heard these quotes literally from staff say, well, we're going to open their eyes with a big fine. I'm like, oh, great. You're going to get them all. Everybody's going to buckle down into OAL for the next 2 years. That sounds fantastic. We're not going to get anything done. So trying to proactively engage the programs and resolve issues, I think, is probably the most effective way to do that. And those processes are there. I mean, starting with the fact that we have an NOV process that still remains. So respond to the NOVs, engage the enforcement program, and try to get to a resolution. I think most of you, certainly in practice in that area, know that that's possible. And it goes back to Irene's point on leadership to get those issues resolved. But I think you have the ability to do that now. Anything else to change OAL sounds like it's way above my pay grade.
But to your point also is that could be something that would be part of a transition report, because it affects everybody that develops the rules. And somebody should walk up to the governor when he comes around or she comes around and say, here's a really big problem. It's hiring, can you tackle civil service? It's OAL, can you tackle the legal rule process? Because you're dragging us down and wasting money.
Yep, Gary and then Dan.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly come back to what Chris had proposed about some type of a task force or a blue ribbon panel. And I think it's so important. I mean, just a sincere thanks to Michelle and Ray for putting this program together to talk about this, to talk about reform, but how much can you do in an hour? How much can you do for preparing for one session? And the way transition works, and I coordinated 2 internal DEP transition documents, and it's a Herculean task, and it takes place after an election in the first week in November until inauguration, which is the second week normally in January. You basically got 2 months during the holidays to write a transition report to help guide the incoming administration. What Chris is proposing from our discussions, which really popped out of how large a task this is to do something more systematically over an appropriate period of time, to take the last year of this administration, and this is unprecedented. I don't believe this has ever been done, but doesn't it make sense to get a cross-cut of the regulated community, alumni, whatever, the right people, getting all stakeholders at the table to think about how we can prepare true, meaningful reform over all the issues that the panelists mentioned today, because they're all relevant, and you probably have a zillion as well of ideas. Right. So I really think it's something we should pursue. Dan?
Just add another acronym, OLS. I think when I started my career working in and around the legislature, the competency and understanding of the staff at OLS was much different than it is now. I think some level of training about all the progress has been made. Those staffers, all they do is they get, and actually legislative staff as well, all they get hit is with advocacy saying the world's coming to an end, hair on fire. They really lack the perspective of how much progress we've made. I'll give credit to Commissioner LaTourette during the budget statements he's made. I think he's been relatively honest about the challenges the department has with staffing. I think that is undisputable when you listen to his words. What I'd want to see is the department to be that brutally honest when legislation's moving forward and talk about how hard this stuff is to move, and how, while they lack the budget, they lack the people at times to move some of these good ideas forward. I think at times, I know that happens behind the scenes, but I've been there, and I've been in seats where I've been told to shut up too, and I know it happens behind the scenes, but it's really hard to sit there in committees and listen to an understaffed, underfunded agency have to basically sit on their hands and not raise what needs to be raised, that the legislatures need to hear, and they're just not hearing it.
One more point, and then we'll come back here to your question, and that is that you also need to make this work. A governor, again, either party, whoever it would be governor, to be deeply committed to the idea of this kind of a process and understanding that it will probably take a two-term governor. This is not a slow process to implement whatever comes out of this. So it isn't just getting the plan, it's then saying, all right, who's going to run with this ball? And it really will need a governor. So during the campaign process next year, there ought to be an effort, if such an effort is underway, to do this kind of a task force, to be working with the candidates as they're going to try to build commitment from them and buy-in from them to actually work with this. You had a question?
Sure. So I got a lot of feelings on this, obviously. Being fresh out of it,
That's right.
thanks, Gary. So I want to say I agree in large part with everything you guys said. Dan, I think you nailed it with the planning parts of this, right? I think as you guys embark on this wonderful adventure.
Did you tell everybody your name? And
Sean Moriarty, former deputy commissioner. I was 3 months ago. I think it's easy for folks who deal with the department from a regulatory perspective to see the department as a problem, right? And I would encourage, as you go through this, and I would love to participate to the extent that you would invite me to, for us to work to find root causes of these things, right? And I don't think all the root causes of what we're talking about exist within 401 East State Street, right? And you talked about needing a governor, you talked about planning, we talked about the legislature, right? Like, I think we have to have a real conversation about institutions and how they function, and the state government as an institution and its overall functioning. Because what happens, and what I've seen very recently, is the department ends up feeling like it is pitted against everyone else when you're talking about affordable housing, when you're talking about these other things, because, like you said, Chris, there is a series of statutes and regulations that they are required to implement. They are required to administer every single day. And what happens is, because of a lack of planning, because of a lack of leadership, and because of a lack of clarity of vision, the affordable housing project comes in, and it's in a floodplain, and then DEP is in the way, right? And what they're really trying to do is their job, right? So you have an institutions plural that just don't work, right? And from a DEP perspective, I want to do all the things you guys said, and if I had an opportunity to do all of those things, I would have, right? But there are not enough people to even sit down and think about the planning that's necessary to implement AI, to plan, to do all the things you're suggesting. That sense of urgency, right, that we want to see, and I agree with you on that. Like, that urgency, people are running around every day with their hair on fire, trying to get something out the door because it has to get out the door, right? So the time to take a breath, to step back, to lead, to come up with new ideas, that is frankly very, very rare in my most recent experience, right? And I think that that's something we really got to focus on. And you got to think about, as a business community and as all of us, like, where are we going to invest and what are we going to invest in? And if DEP is a restraint or a constraint on the progress you want to see, then you have a conversation about how you invest in that. I don't think the regulatory structure is going away, right? As Gary said, how many laws get repealed? So if we're going to deal in this highly regulated arena, how are we going to invest in that to make it work for everybody? Thank you.
All good points, and probably a good point to end on, Ray. So thank you all, panelists, and thank you all for participating.
Boy, that was excellent. What I think I heard from that last panel, beyond some excellent suggestions, is they have all volunteered to be on that task force. And I'm not sure, but I think I heard Chris Daggett announce his running for governor next time. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. But I'm going to thank you all for being here today. Hopefully you found the panels as informative and as worthwhile as I have. I want to thank our sponsors again, CSG, NJR, Clean Energy, AMT, Focus, New Jersey, Manufacturing, NJ Business, and who's that? NJBIA supports it, I can't forget them. So I want to thank you all. I want to mention one thing, put it on your calendars right now. Our 4th annual energy conference is coming up on October the 15th. I believe it's here. Betty, it's going to be here again? She's not even listening to me. She doesn't know. But put in your calendar, it's happening. It's going to be another great day of great speakers. We'll be doing another environmental conference next year. Again, we'll be doing EJ, and we'll have to take up a lot of some of the tasks that we've heard today. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.